Tri-State Freethinkers podcast lecture series from November 11th, 2015, Population Stabilization, with our speaker, John Seager, President of Population Connection.
Well, I've been traveling all over the country this fall, which is not unusual for me. Yesterday, I spoke to 300 students at the University of Maryland. I can tell you they were enthusiastic, they were excited, they asked all kinds of really great questions, and I get that kind of response from young people all over the country. Older people don't really care for me, but that's okay. I wanted to mention something that happened, before I get into the talk itself, something that happened to me early on in this fall speaking tour. I was speaking up in north of Boston, and I had a little time at the end of the day. And so I drove over to a community called Danvers. It's about 45 minutes, hour north of Boston. There's a state police barracks there. And I parked at the state police barracks, and off to the side of the barracks, there's just a little pathway. It doesn't have a sign or anything, just a little pathway. I walked up it and found myself in a very small cemetery. I had gone there to visit the gravesite of a cousin of mine, whose name is Anne. Anne never had children. Anne died in her 30s. And Anne was buried in an unmarked grave in this small cemetery. When Anne was 12 years old, my cousin Anne, she played a key role in one of the defining moments in our culture. This was in 1692. My cousin, Ann Putnam, Jr., was one of the young girls who leveled the accusations that resulted in the Salem witchcraft trials and the deaths of people who were accused of consorting with Satan. And indeed, she, of course, obviously I never knew her, but she was my cousin, is my cousin. And what that was all about was hysteria. Those were dark times. I mean, it wasn't easy. Danvers in those days wasn't called Danvers. It was called Salem Village. Salem's the town next door, but Danvers was Salem Village. And coincidentally, I still have family that live in Danvers, of all things. And there was this, a lot of hardship, a lot of fear, intense religiosity, very narrow views. And so when these young girls, 12 years old, level these accusations of involvement with the devil and witches, innocent people were put to their deaths. And I think the reason that we remember this, the reason that this resonates, is because it was a long time ago, but it really wasn't a long time ago. That kind of thing, on different ways, in different levels, hatred of the other, ascribing things to this satanic figure. Years later, Anne stood up and recanted what she had done. But in her recanting, she blamed Satan. So, in a way, she said, "I'm sorry I did it, but Satan made me do it." So, the first really great, if you will, highly noted English jurist was a man named Blackstone, who was of that era. Blackstone is routinely quoted in the Supreme Court. Blackstone believed in a living Satan. Blackstone believed in a living Satan. So all of this was a long time ago, but it wasn't really that long ago in a lot of ways. And I think when we look at the challenges we face, we may be heading, for some people on earth, these are already very dark times. For others, these are wonderful times. But if you see some of what's going on around the world, I think there's some pretty strong cause for possible concern, and more than that. I want to start with this quote. I don't usually like to throw quotes up, but I think this is such a great quote for three reasons. First, because it doesn't mince any words. I get the feeling the free thinkers don't really like people who sort of weasel around the corners. You'd rather people come right out and say stuff. Well, when you refer to something as a plague, that's about as strong as it gets. That's about as strong as it gets. You're just hitting it right on. The second thing I like about this quote is this notion that there's a way to meet the challenge. That we know how to fix this. And the third thing I like about the quote is that second line, which is, how do you get beyond just knowing that something needs to be done and actually acting on it? You know, I happen to know I need to lose some weight. Just saying. I now have one of these little Fitbits, so I measure how many steps I take every day. I'll probably end up putting it on a metronome and never walking again. But my point is, there's that difference between just knowing something's a problem and acting on it. The final reason I really like this quote is because of the person who wrote it. This was written by the only American who we honor by having a separate day set aside for him. These were Dr. King's words. These were Dr. King's words in 1966. Dr. King understood that, as with so many other great challenges, they fall heaviest on those who, by virtue of fortune and circumstance, are least well equipped to deal with it. And he also, of course, understood, I think, better than any other American, how to move from just knowing about something to acting on it. And I want to return to that theme in a bit. I want to tell one more short story before I get into the main body of it. And it's about this young woman here named Christine Marty. This picture was taken 4 years ago. At that time, Christine Marty was an undergraduate college student, and she was home in Pittsburgh on October 19th, 4 years ago, driving along Washington Boulevard next to the Allegheny River with her mother. And that afternoon, that Friday afternoon, the rain was coming down in torrents. Their car got trapped in the water. At some points that afternoon on Washington Boulevard, the water reached 9 feet deep. The water started coming up the sides of their car. Christine and her mother rolled down the windows, climbed up onto the roof of the car. Just then, Christine spied in another car an older woman just sitting there motionless. The older woman's name, Christine later learned, was Romy Connolly. Romy was 69 years old. Romy had lung cancer, and Romy didn't know how to swim. I have come to believe that what happened next on that Friday afternoon in Pittsburgh may hold the key to meeting one of the great challenges of our time. And I know it's a mean trick, but it's an old trick, and I'll stick with it. I'm going to hold off on telling you what happened, go into the main body of the talk. By the way, if you ever notice, reporters do that a lot. They'll set up a story, and then they go, oh, now we'll tell you some facts. And then they come back to it. I will come back to it, and then you can decide if my notion that what happened that afternoon, is connected with the challenge of human population growth is a valid one or not. But that's really for you to decide. Just as the water was rising that afternoon in Pittsburgh, water is rising around the world. To date, as a consequence of climate change, global warming, sea levels have risen about 8 inches, which, you know, it's significant, but it's still relatively modest. A recent scientific report indicated that sea levels may rise 10 feet between now and the end of the century. Not will, may. We've never run this particular science experiment before. Let's heat up the planet and see what happens. That will get an A on the science test. So we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but eminent scientists believe that sea levels may rise 10 feet between now and the end of the century as a consequence of climate change, which in turn is a consequence of fossil fuel emissions, which in turn is a consequence of our consumption and use of them, which of course is closely related to how many of us there are. It all kind of adds up. The picture here is of the tiny island nation of Kiribati. The average height of that in that whole country is 6 feet above sea level. The highest point in that whole country is 12 feet above sea level. Now, ocean hydrology is complex. I don't mean to simplify complicated science, but it seems to me and to others that a potential rise in sea levels of 10 feet could be very bad news for that particular country. And I'm sure the people who live there care about where they live as much as the people who live here. It isn't just places far away. Almost 40% of us in this country including absolutely nobody in this room except me, I suspect. I actually don't quite live on the coastline, but almost 40% of us live in those narrow blue areas. Many of those areas are within that zone. In Florida, more than 25% of all the households are below that 10-foot sea level area. What is Florida made of? Sand, exactly. You can't build a seawall around sand. The water just comes right up through the sand. It's not going to work. You just can't. In New York City, about 750,000 people live below that 10-foot level. Globally, about 600 plus million people live below that 10-foot level. Have you seen the pictures coming out of Europe recently and Syria? You know, I wrote a column about 7 weeks ago for our magazine about the refugees and the challenge. And when I read it, I have to write that about 5-6 weeks before deadline. And when I read it, I read my column and said, I made a mistake here. I had written in my column that there were hundreds of refugees. It's actually hundreds of thousands. And I thought I goofed. And then I realized, no, I didn't. 6 weeks earlier, the reports were hundreds. That's how fast things got bad. Now, instead of hundreds of thousands, imagine potentially, I'm not trying to be an alarmist, I'm just trying to use the numbers here, potentially hundreds of millions of refugees, thousands of times more. Because many of the people who live in those lowest lying areas are people who live in places like Bangladesh. You know, a couple of years ago, India and Bangladesh were squabbling over some irrelevant tiny island. And they went out one spring to renew their argument, and the island was gone. I see somebody nodding. The water had risen. They went, where's this island? We're going to fight about it. Oh, it's gone. So there's one case, where probably the only instance where climate change has actually helped to resolve a problem. They couldn't fight about the island anymore because it was gone. But these are the kind of challenges we're facing, and these are things that we've never really quite faced before. And you know, the people who are raising the alarms are accused of hyperbole, you know, and I don't know if any of you are familiar with a wonderful writer named Lester Brown, who's a friend of mine, who's written many books about food and other issues. And he's raised the alarm on a number of things. And I asked Lester one day, what do you say to your critics who say, oh, Lester, you're just overstating things. He said, well, I sure hope they're right. He said, because if I'm right, and the facts suggest he may be, we're in for a very difficult time. Let me pause so briefly so I don't forget, because I tend to, and then I'm annoyed with myself. If anybody would like to hear more from us, me or us, just jot your name and email down, and we'll be happy to be in touch with you. When you get tired of it, we'll just take you off the list. Easy as that. There are so many impacts of human population growth. I don't have time to get into all of them because I want to get to how we can meet some of those challenges. But I want to touch on several others. One is this. This is a picture here of a dolphin, specifically the Yangtze River dolphin, also called the baiji. They were around for 20 million years. A century ago, there were between 3,000 and 5,000 of them. They lived in the Yangtze River Delta, estuarine dolphin. They appear now to be extinct. I say appear because you can't prove a negative. Biologists can't find any of them, but that doesn't mean there isn't a pod somewhere. Unlike our opponents, I think we try to be careful with the facts and not just state things as fact where they're just simply what we know based on what we know. What killed the baiji? Sewage, agricultural runoff, industrial effluent, all driven by our consumption and our rapid population growth. The baiji may be extinct. There are tens of thousands of plant and animal species that are on the brink of potential extinction. I could spend from now until next month just showing you pictures. I will just pick two. One, and this is how many are left outside captivity. There are 156 Iberian lynx. I picked them because they're really cute. The other one I picked, because it's even cuter, is the northern hairy-nosed wombat, which shows there's somebody for everybody out there. I'm sure that wombat would rather meet another wombat than a lynx. But In every case that I know of, and I keep hoping somebody will say, wait a minute, you're wrong. Here's an example where you're wrong. In every case I know of, it is we humans who are pushing these species into extinction. Overhunting, overfishing. And let me note that, the first conservationists in this country were the people who hunt and fish. Any responsible hunter, any responsible person who fishes knows that you have bag limits and that you conserve the resource. But we're not doing a very good job of that around the world these days. Forest fragmentation, destruction of habitat, climate change. In Central America, as it heats up, the species move up the hills. Well, what happens when they run out of hill? That's the challenge here. We haven't seen an extinction of this magnitude since the time of the dinosaurs. So, which according to that other group that the fellow talked about was 5,000 years ago when we rode them around. But anyway, to be serious, it's a true and real challenge. Now this goes over better, frankly, with students, but that's okay. I'm going to play something very brief for you and see if anybody here, I don't know if anybody here, hopefully somebody here can tell me what I'm playing here. If anybody knows what this is, what the name of this song, it's called Name That Tune. May take a second to get going. Yes, exactly. Everlong by Dave Grohl and the Foo Fighters. Great song. By the way, that's a song that Dave Letterman asked to have. They played him out on his show last day. Now, why do I play this? Of the fact that it's a great song, but which actually makes me a little sad because, as I said to those students at the University of Maryland, when that first song came out, those kids were not even born, some of them, which makes me really feel old. Why do I play the Foo Fighters song? Because it has a beat, and the beat is 158 beats per minute. That's the rate of human population growth. That's how fast we're adding people to the planet. Every beat in that song is births minus deaths. Every single one, that means human population is increasing. We add about 10,000 people an hour. We add 250,000 a day. That's like having to build a whole city for 1 million people every 4 days. Water, sewer, houses, hospitals, jobs, bridges, all those things. 83 million people a year. That's what we add to this planet's population. The growth is of fairly recent vintage. It took all of human history until 1800 to get to 1 billion. Today we add another billion every dozen years. And this chart here, which is to scale, is pretty astonishing in my view. We go from pretty much almost flat horizontal, very little growth, to near vertical growth. And it happened right there around 1800. What happened in 1800? Industrial Revolution, as a kind of part and parcel of that, it was the earliest rudiments of modern public health and modern sanitation. It's not that people are living longer. They are not. Human life expectancy still tops out at maybe 115. I always feel terrible when I hear there's a new woman. It's always a woman who's the oldest person on earth. I say, boy, I'd rather be the second oldest, because if you're the oldest, you know what's coming. I mean, it's like, no. I don't want to give that to somebody else. I don't need that honor. If in colonial times, in our colonial times, in the U.S., women had an average of 7 children each, but only 2 or 3 made it past childhood, generally. What happened in the early 1800s was perhaps the most miraculous positive event in our history as a species. Children surviving their childhood due to basic public health, soap and water, that kind of thing, basic sewage management, those sorts of things. So all of a sudden, children began to survive their childhood, which is wonderful, but that even wonderful events can have consequences. You know, if you win the lottery, I guarantee you're going to discover you have a lot more cousins than you ever knew you had, speaking of cousins. Now, why does it top out here in 2100? It tops out there not because that's what's expected, but because there's no data past that point. Again, we, and I hope by we I'm encompassing the folks in this room, I believe I am, are looking at facts. We're not looking at, invisible people up in the sky so much. And if there are up there, didn't mean you, I meant that other invisible person. Anyway, my point being, there's no data past 2100. You would have to know how many children the kids in college today, how many children would their great-grandchildren have? And when you have no data, you can't make any reasonable assumptions. So it tops out around 2100 just because there's no data past this point. This growth, this population growth, is wildly uneven in its distribution. The blue line at the bottom are the haves. Countries like the United States, places like Western Europe, places like Canada, South Korea, Australia, Japan, places like that. We have no natural population growth. There's some growth through migration, although virtually all migration is actually between very poor places and not to the have countries as a percentage. Migration to wealthy countries is maybe 2% of all migration. Nonetheless, population growth is in, and the net migration we have in the US is offset by declines in some other places in the world going forward. It's in the poorest places on Earth. That's where the rapid population growth is taking place. The epicenter for it today is Africa. Africa has about 1 billion people compared. It's about 3 times the size of population for that continent as the US. 1 billion people in Africa. According to the UN's best projections, Africa will have 4.4 billion people by the end of the century. Will that happen? We don't know, but that's what the data suggests. So you have this very much of a split world. Rapid population growth in some parts of Central America, the Caribbean, almost all of Africa, much of the Middle East, and a significant portion of Western Asia, the part more toward the Fertile Crescent. That's where you, and the Indian subcontinent. Those are the areas where you see rapid population growth still. The UN does projections. You notice they don't do predictions. They don't have like a magic 8-ball. They do 100,000 data runs on each country every several years. They try to come up with their best reasoning as to what is going to happen. Their medium variant is their best reasoning at this point. It's the one where they do all these complicated projections where most of them tend to land in that vicinity. They're suggesting that we will grow from about 7.3 billion, we'll add another 4 billion people to the planet by the end of the century. Now, this top line here, almost 26 billion, that's how many people will be on the planet by the end of the century if family size in every country stays where it is today. Nobody really thinks that's going to happen, but nonetheless, it's an interesting illustration of what would happen. The other 2 lines, that blue line and the green line that the UN produces, are what-if lines. What if, as compared with the medium, what if every woman on Earth had 1/2 child more on average? Instead of 7+ billion, we'd have over, instead of 11+ billion, we'd have over 16 billion. 1/2 child, that's the difference. On the other hand, if every woman on Earth on average had a 1/2 child fewer, instead of hitting 11 billion, basically we'd see a little more growth followed by very gradual decline back to about where we are now. I know people, and I'm being quite serious here, who are really worried about this. They think that we're going to face, this people shortage. Now, I haven't noticed it on the interstates. It doesn't seem to be, maybe a shortage of sensible people, but no great shortage of people. But let's give folks their due. Let's extend this line way out over there. My pointer won't go, but we're way over there, and say millennia from now. Let's say we get to a point where people, well, I won't be around, but oh my God, there's a people shortage. There's not enough people. How can we get people? There must be a way. Where do you, there is an app, and I think they have that film strip in 7th grade. If you weren't there that day, ask somebody after the meeting. Maybe they can explain it all to you briefly. But what is going to happen is going to depend on what we do. Now, 11 years ago, the UN, and they do this every couple of years, they did the same exercise, the same process. 11 years ago, they said we would hit 9 billion in 2100. Now they're saying 11.2 billion. And it's not because they're not good at what they do. It's because a number of things, that positive, voluntary things that people hoped were happening, haven't happened in places such as Africa, much of Africa and other places. Things aren't going as well as people had hoped they would be. And there are some very specific reasons for that. So how many people can our planet support? I get an email or a call every week from somebody who seems to know the answer. And the answer's never the same, but they're always sure. A demographer named Joel Cohen wrote a book on this subject. By the way, in that book, and he's a very eminent demographer, he also wrote that 98.3% of all statistics are made up, including that one. But what Joel Cohen did after studying every projection done in the last 400 years, he came to the conclusion, it's a dense volume, well thought through, that it's an unanswerable question. Or more specifically, the answer to the question can only come forward if you ask yourself two other questions. How do I want to live? And how do I want everybody else to live? Everybody else in this room, in this community, in this country, on this planet, generations to come, and of course all the other critters. Until you answer those two questions, you can't come up with an answer on this. Now, you can take the data and slice it an infinite number of ways. Here are a couple of quick takes. If everybody on Earth sought to eat the traditional, typical American diet in terms of meat, there would be enough meat produced for 2 billion people to have meat, 5 billion don't get any. If everybody ate the diet typical of the Indian subcontinent, a little bit of animal protein, lots of rice and vegetables, there are enough calories produced today so that every person on Earth can have a nutritious diet. To which I've heard some people say, well, then this is just a distribution problem, not a population problem. The problem with that is that, and it's been my observation through life, that there may be enough to go around, but it never quite gets around. You remember a few years ago those miners who were trapped in South America? And you imagine if you had been above ground and you had said to them, oh, don't worry, there's lots of oxygen up here, Well, that's good for you, but distribution problems are big problems. Now, here's kind of another wrinkle. Some places on Earth are moving up the affluence chain, and you will find McDonald's in China. And until a student sadly set me right, I used to say that signs of McDonald's in China, Americans are trying to kill us. I've thought if we're worried about Chinese competitiveness, just stuff them so full of Big Macs they can't move, and then they won't be able to do anything and we'll take over the world. No, the point here is that as people become more affluent, they tend to switch to a more heavily meat-intensive diet. That takes a lot more resources in terms of production of protein than vegetable protein. So that's another trend that's going on. Here's another choice that we could look at. If we all wanted to live the way the very poorest people do in East Africa today, there's room on this planet for about 40 billion of us based on current resource production. I do not want to live that way. I hate the idea that those folks have no choice but to live that way. But if that's the future we want, then we don't have to worry about the numbers at all. I mean, we'll all be there if we just let it not be dealt with one way or another. How many people have heard of Norman Borlaug? Norman Borlaug and his team saved more lives than any human being who ever lived. They are credited with saving 1 billion lives from famine, from starvation. In the 50s, 60s, up into the 70s, his team pioneered the Green Revolution, which dramatically increased crop yields, particularly in some of the poorest places on Earth. Now, there's a consequence to that, and the consequence is a lot of what the techniques that he pioneered are heavily petrochemical intensive. Pesticides, fertilizers, things like that. I don't fault him for one moment for doing it. I commend him for doing it. But it's having a consequence. I would also note that when Dr. Borlaug received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for his efforts, in Oslo, in his acceptance speech, he said, none of this is going to do any good if we don't deal with population growth. We're just postponing things. That's all we're doing, and he deserves great credit for what he did. But he was the first to admit that it was just a temporary stopgap measure.
All right. We have the Piggest Raffle is one way that we can raise money to help do all the great things that we do at the Tri-State Freethinkers. So if you go to piggestraffle.com you can buy a pig for $5, and you can, that money goes directly to the Tri-State Freethinkers, and you're entered into a raffle to where you could potentially win $5,000 for you and $5,000 for us. So it is the gift that kind of keeps on giving. And there's also a lease of a Toyota Prius and lots of other great prizes that you could win. So please go to piggistraffle.com, buy a piggy, and help us.
How long can you live without water? How long?
15 days.
Well, depends. I've heard various numbers. Now, I was speaking in Brevard College in the Smoky Mountains the other day, and a student asked me, he said, do we have beer? I said, no, you can't have beer. No, that, I understand you could live for a long time without water if you have beer, but I meant without any kind of liquid. Water, fresh water, potable water is a very specific limiting resource. You can live without a lot of things for a long time, but when you're out of water, you're out of luck. I'll just note that Lake Victoria, pictured here, serves the needs of people in 3 African nations. The yellow here is pretty low population density. The red is at least 4 times as many people. And there's a timeline down there, 1960. You can see, and I mentioned Africa before, you can see in this one part of Africa what's happening with population growth around this vital water source. The lake is not growing. In fact, it's shrinking a bit. The demands are growing tremendously. We're going to see water wars and food wars, or at least on some level. There's no doubt about that. The question is how much and where. About 800 million people, that's about 1 out of 9 of us in this world, face some degree of water scarcity every day. There's a concern about whether there's sufficient safe water to drink. Dirty water kills more children than any other single fact in the world, cause rather. And you know, it's not that we don't know how to produce clean water, it's just that when people live, as about 1 out of 7 of us do, on barely more than $1 a day, you don't have the resources to produce it. You know, if this room were the world, everybody from about here over would not have indoor plumbing. So you might want to move over there. In India, more people have cell phones and have access to indoor modern sanitation. Because how do you get a cell phone? You put up some towers, you sell some phones, you're in business, right? It takes a very complex infrastructure, very expensive system to provide modern plumbing. And when you've got rapid population growth and extreme poverty, these things combine to make a disastrous situation. This picture here shows the Aral Sea, which was, this was about 1989, this was the 4th largest freshwater body in the world, in Western Asia. This composite photograph is the same lake less than 20 years later. That lake was the size of North Carolina in 1989. Now, there are efforts going on at this point at reclamation. We'll see how they go. But what happened was the Aral Sea was tapped. It's a lake, they call it a sea, for drinking water, for agricultural use. That's how fast things can go bad. That's how fast things can go bad. This is also a picture of the Aral Sea. Where those trawlers are sitting used to be the Aral Sea not many years ago. Now, I suspect the camels are happy because they found a shady spot to hang out, but it's not a good long-term prospect for places like that when that's what's happening to vital resources. So how do we meet this challenge? I said we're adding 1 billion people every dozen years. How do we meet that challenge? What do we say, for example, to women in places like Niger and Chad, in Africa, just the bottom rim of the Sahara, who have on average close to 7 children each? By the way, I try not to use what are sometimes called poverty porn pictures. I try to use pictures that are more positive and affirming because, well, for lots of reasons, but one of them is this. There's one thing that I am dead certain this woman does not need, and women like her, and that is she does not need a lecture from me. She does not need to be told to care about her family. A former congressman, it was a Republican, believe it or not, guy I'd known for about 40 years, who left a few years ago because I don't think you could take the craziness. He was a good supporter of family planning. They're scarce as hen's teeth in that party these days. But he stood up on the floor of the House one day and said, in defense of family planning, that mothers in Africa are just like mothers anywhere. They would walk barefoot across broken glass to save their children. So she doesn't need to be told to care about her family. And as we look at the ways to meet this challenge, in my view, it is paramount that at all times we respect her rights, her integrity, her independence, and respect her privacy. I love that sign. I can tell you, I don't know who lives on the other side of it. I'm not going to be wandering over there. It's a pretty blunt sign. But it makes a point, and the point is that, at least in my view, based on my values, nobody, anywhere, anytime, for any reason, has any right to tell any woman when, whether, and how many children to bear. It's her business, not my business. That's where I come from. Those are my values. By happy coincidence, there's a way to meet this challenge. And it's a breakthrough technology. And that's what it is. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to what that might be? It was the first birth control pill approved for that use in 1962 by the FDA here in the United States. By the way, the hormonal levels in those pills were 100 times higher than current pills. They were just learning how to use them. Since then, there have been a lot of other advances in different methods. I completely agree that research has been lagging on male contraception. A young person at a meeting I was at earlier this year said, you know, if men could get pregnant, birth control pills would be free and bacon flavored. You know, it just, I'll take a few of these. But the fact is, I would be prepared to argue, and I could see somebody taking another side, that modern contraception is the single most transformative technology in human history. Now, you could say penicillin, you could say the printing press, you might say Netflix, I don't know, you all have our own takes on what's most important in life. But for the first time in the history of the world, half of the population on Earth doesn't have to depend on the other half, if you will, for the trajectory of their lives. So how do we use that to meet these challenges? Well, I want to tell you briefly about two societies that are quite different from our own. We've certainly done it here. Back in 1961, women had 3.4 children each in the United States. We stopped at 2 children 35 years ago and have shown no signs of changing that behavior. I want to tell you about 2 other countries that might surprise you and might even confound you a bit, but we'll see. The first is Iran. Iran is an Islamic theocracy. I do not care to live in an anything theocracy. I don't care what the first word is. I don't like it if it's got theocracy in there. But that's what Iran is. In 1985, women in Iran were having 6.5 children each. That was a typical family size. The leaders, all men, I might add, said, this is we're going to have a terrible problem. But what they did might surprise you. They didn't put in coercive measures or force people to do anything. And I've met with an OBGYN who practices there, and she confirms what all the data and research says. Instead, in Iran, they did 5 things starting in 1985. They made family planning, birth control freely available. 2, they dramatically increased university enrollment for young women. Most of the college students in Iran today are women. By the way, there are efforts in Iran, which is a very complex country, to undo everything I'm talking about. We'll see what happens. But nonetheless, this is what they did. Number 3, public service ads to promote family planning. TV and radio. Number 4, this is an interesting one. If you are a man and a woman and you want to move in together, you don't just do that in Iran. You're going to get married first. That's the way it works there. You go to the clerk, and the clerk says, oh, how nice. Let me see the certificate showing that you took your family planning course. You know, it's a little like driver ed. Don't get on the interstate till you know how to run the thing. Finally, the cultural leaders there, and the cultural leaders in Iran, by and large, are the clergy. They gave out a series of messages saying, and I know well the room I'm in now when I say this, I think we're able to embrace facts even if they're somewhat inconvenient. That's what free thinking is about, in my view. They said that tranquility is an Islamic virtue. And then they went on to say that small families are more tranquil. Now, what I know about the Quran wouldn't fill a thimble. But as a parent of grown children, I can assure you that children do not bring tranquility. They are really bad at it. If that's your goal in life, don't have kids. There's plenty of reasons to have kids, plenty of reasons to not have kids, but tranquility is high on, if you make a list of the 3 things you want most in life, and tranquility is there, you might want to consider not having children. You can borrow them if you ever want them, Lord knows. Second, I'll just point out that if your goal is just to have the biggest pile of toys at the end of the game, don't have kids either, because the only toys you'll have are broken plastic ones, because it's really expensive to raise. But they gave out cultural and social signals saying that small families are okay. So what happened since 1985 in Iran with those 6.5 average family? I'll tell you in a moment. But first I want to tell you about Mexico. Mexico, our neighbor to the south. Mexico is a heavily Catholic country. In 1970, they had 6.7 children on average, 6.7. Now, Mexico, it's a strange culture. They have this very weird idea, which is that churches and religious institutions are to be respected over here, government over there. Don't mix the two. It's like chocolate shakes and liver. Don't mix them, you know? A chocolate shake, you want liver, but don't. Keep them separate. I don't think that idea will go over as well, perhaps north of the border, but hopefully we could learn something from them. The leaders in Mexico did 3 things. Literacy, reading and writing, for everybody. 2, family planning, made it freely available. Our tax dollars helped pay for that. Incidentally, we don't help Mexico anymore, and it has nothing to do with politics. It has to do with the fact that we were a good neighbor. They don't need the help anymore. In effect, they said, thanks for helping when we need it, but we got it covered, as you'll see. 3rd, comprehensive sex education in the schools. This is supposed to be condoms. It looks like a paper airplane, but it's condoms. Older brother talking to the younger brother. You can see what he's saying there. I have weird fantasies, but one of them, shows you how weird they are, is imagine if, say, tomorrow, President Obama sent a poster, adapted for our country, like this, home with every 5th grader. I can tell you, if I heard about it, wherever I was, I would go to the nearest television and turn on Fox News. Just to watch the craziness. I don't know that it would go over quite as well here as it did there. But here's what happened in Mexico and Iran. Mexico got started first. They were at 6.7 children in 1970. Today, they are at 2.3. 2.1 is essentially replacement rate in a society with reasonably good health. Couple has 2 kids. The math's pretty simple. They're at 2.3. They're very close to there. Had they not done this, you would have seen an additional 50+ million unplanned births in Mexico if they'd stayed on the former trajectory. Now, there is a fellow running for president. I'll bet I can, if I just say one word, the hair. Do I need to say more? It's good branding. There you go. He's good at that. Give him that. Give him the branding. I've heard him talk at great length about the tidal wave of illegal immigrants coming into this country. Over the past 5, excuse me?
Some are good people.
Some are apparently, and some are everywhere you go. Over the past 5 years, and it takes you 15 seconds on the internet to look it up, and from a reputable source, a number of them, net illegal immigration, of course there's some people who come into our country illegally, but then others who are here illegally leave. Net illegal immigration to the United States over the past 5 years has been 0. It stuns me that nobody in the media will bring this up. I mean, they could just say, well, Mr. Trump, what do you have to, or whoever, what do you have to say about this? See what he says. He's quick on his feet. See what he has to say. Part of that, there are complex reasons. The economic downturn certainly drove that for a while, but we seem to be, in a somewhat different phase now. But clearly the fact that people and women and couples in Mexico have small families now means they're much better equipped to provide opportunity for their children in their own country so that they have a chance to stay in the place they call home. Iran went from 6.5 children to 2 in just 16 years without any coercion, any forcing, anything like that. Now, we did not help in Iran because we don't really have a great relationship with them, and vice versa. We did help in Mexico, and the United States has helped in many other countries around the world. We invest, by we, I mean our government, I mean our taxes. We invest about $600 million a year in international family planning. This is what we get for our money. We are able to enable women and couples to prevent 6 million unplanned births a year, about $100 per unplanned birth prevented. Now, if I stop there, I'd go, yeah, it seems like a pretty good return on investment, all things considered. But this is what else it does. It averts 5 million abortions. My board chair is an OBGYN who went to a medical school called Harvard. Pretty smart guy, Joe is. And I asked Joe, I said, Joe, tell me, you're a doctor. In the history of the world, has any woman ever had an abortion who was not first pregnant? And he said, no, that has never happened. I'm not making light of the subject in any way. I'm just pointing out a medical fact as assured by a doctor. You would think that the politicians, and I don't use that term in a derogatory way, you would think that the politicians who are most vocal in opposition to abortion, and I work for a proudly pro-choice organization, but you would think those who are most concerned about abortion would be the ones who would be standing up and working for family planning, with rare and noteworthy exceptions, one of them being, I'm a Pennsylvanian, my senator, one of my 2 senators, Bob Casey. He's devout Catholic, he's opposed to abortion, but he's generally a good supporter of family planning and sex ed. I disagree with him on the question of choice, but I at least respect the logic of his thinking that he understands the importance of family planning and sex ed. I don't understand the thinking of people who consider abortion maybe their top issue in terms of preventing it, and yet they vote no on family planning. Now, that's all we get for that? No, wait, remember those late night shows? Wait, there's more if you act now. This we also get with that money. We save almost 500,000 children's lives a year with that resource, because when women can plan and space their children, the children are more likely to survive. Guess who else survives? Their mothers. Their mothers survive too, because their bodies are not put through the tremendous stress of pregnancy and birth every 11 months or so. All of this we do for $2 per American per year. That's about a nickel per American per week. Our organization, Population Connection, has at the very top of our advocacy agenda doubling that money. We'd like to add another nickel and double those results. Now, remember Christine, who I left sitting on the roof of that car with her mother, and remember Romy Connolly sitting motionless in her car? Let me tell you what happened on that August afternoon 4 years ago. Well, first let me tell you what didn't happen. Christine, the college student, did not decide to jump into the water, swim over to Romy's car, and rescue her. She did not decide to do that. When Christine received the Carnegie Medal for heroism, and she was asked why she did it, she said, why she decided to do it, she said, I didn't decide to do anything. I just jumped into the water and did it. We humans are hardwired to help each other. We're hardwired. There is, and we can get into, if somebody wants to, we can get into it later, there is an evolutionary basis for kindness. And the simplest way to describe it is this. Survival of the fittest isn't going to do you a lick of good if you're the only member of your species who survives. You're going to be pretty lonely, and then that's going to be the end of the story. We are hardwired to try to do good things. Not all of us, but most of us do that, and it's instantaneous. The challenge today, and this is the linkage that I'm trying to make, is how do we do it for people who aren't motionless in a car 10 feet in front of us, but they may be on the other side of the world in a village we've never heard of that we'll never go to? I know of no more efficacious way, faster way to help meet those challenges than through universal awareness of and access to affordable voluntary contraception. There are 225 million women around the world today, and I'm wrapping up now, who have an unmet need for contraception. That means they already want to postpone having another child, or not have any more at all. but there are barriers in their way of their using contraception, sometimes very complex barriers. It would cost the world about $5 billion a year to meet that need. There are more than 20 donor nations around the world. We're not the only one. We're the largest because we're the largest, but we're not the only one by any means. A fair and reasonable share for the United States would be about another $500 or $600 million a year. Plus, that would put us in a position of saying to the other countries, hey, you know what? We're in. How about you? We just doubled our money. How about you double? How about Norway, France, Australia? How about you double? We chipped in, now you chip in. It's very hard to go to somebody and say, double your investment. What are you putting in? Well, no, not me. No, it's your job. It would make such a difference to the world, for those women and for our planet. You know, human population growth is the only challenge I know of where globally, where we know what works. It's not that expensive, and it could transform the lives of millions of people. We bring hundreds of people. Anybody, by the way, we do a program every April or so in DC. Anybody, we would rather not, people who completely disagree with us should go to somebody else's program. I'm sure they're there. Anybody who wants to pay their own way is welcome. We pay through the support of our 40,000 donors. We don't have any government money or anything like that. We pay the way for hundreds of college students to come to DC to learn about the issue, and then they go up, and last year they lobbied at 163 congressional offices on behalf of more funds for family planning. A website called Bustle, which somebody may have heard of, did a feature on it last year, and we just handed some of the students a whiteboard, and we just asked them to say why they came in their own words. And it's a wonderfully eclectic, diverse group of students from all over the country who stated why they were there. It's a big part of what we do as an organization, is to try to make sure that legislators know that there are people back home who expect them to do the right thing. Some legislators will never be with us, some will be always with us, but there are others who are persuaded by their constituents. We, of course, try to make all of these connections to population. The other thing we do as an organization is we have America's best and only, that's the trick to being the best at anything, really. You don't even really have to be very good. But we have the only nationwide population education program. Our materials, we produce K through 12 curriculum materials. They meet national and state standards. For example, and they may or may not be useful to your program, the wonderful program that our friend here was telling us about, Maples. See, you were right there. We, for example, in STEM, anybody can go and look at, say, 12th grade. It's a website, it takes a couple of seconds. 12th grade or 10th grade or 3rd grade, math, science, social studies. Click on our website, click on the grade level, click on the subject, click on the state. It will show the standards that teachers have to meet, and then it shows which of our materials correlate to that standard, so that a third-party verifier does it, so that we're able to go into schools with these materials. We do not tell students what to think. We just want them to think, which I gather is a principle of free thinking, is getting them to think, presenting them with scenarios and alternatives, and then letting them work through it and come to the conclusions they come to. As I alluded to earlier, the other half of our work is trying to persuade a more intractable bunch, which is the 535 women and men on Capitol Hill, to support these programs. They're under attack every single day. Most of the attacks, frankly, are on our good friends at Planned Parenthood. And if you don't support your local Planned Parenthood, do it. That's where it all starts. You know, when people ask me, what can I do? I say, that's the first thing to do. Then I hope you'll support us. But support your local Planned Parenthood, because when I say they're on the front lines, they're on the front lines. I mean, under attack, and not just rhetorically either. I know that we can transform things. When President Obama took office, we saw a 40% increase in funding for international family planning programs, and a lot of other improvements as well. It seems like light years ago, or a long time ago, but it was only, 5.5, 6 years ago. We can get back there. It's possible. If we don't do it, I cannot predict exactly which of the awful scenarios is going to come to pass. but I am dead certain that much of it will. And it will hit the people on earth who are least well equipped to deal with it. And that's what keeps me up at night and keeps me going. So thank you so much for your time and attention.
Yes, I understand that my whole life is just a blink of an eye. The history of the earth is with each moment that goes by. But this moment that I'm with you, it feels like time has stood still. It feels somehow like it matters, and that it always will. Thank you so much.